next speaker, Lee Bailey, who joins us from Tupperware Brands, who are probably one of the few truly ubiquitous organizations on the planet. I doubt there's a household anywhere that does not have a piece of Tupperware either in their home or in their organization right now. Lee, if you could switch on your camera and join us, that would be very much appreciated. Lee has spent most of his career so far leading cybersecurity change and initiatives for a range of well-known organizations, obviously including his current position at Tupperware, but from ABC Fine Wine and Spirits and Lockheed Martin. His role includes introducing solutions while deploying companies to foundational advanced cybersecurity solutions while deploying and governing enterprise resources. Having spearheaded numerous complex program initiatives, is known to align people, teams, systems, programs, and technical resources to advance the company vision and mission. His track record demonstrates continuously delivering results for these organizations. So with no further ado and with a great deal of pleasure, please let me hand you over to Lee. Lee, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to start sharing my presentation and turn off my webcam here so that you can focus on the presentation. All right, awesome. Well, definitely great to see or have all 15 people here on the call with us. Thank you very much. Hopefully we'll get some more people filtering in. This topic is enterprise architecture, nothing new for you all. And when you think about that bio, definitely a lot of you all are doing all the same things. You're putting complicated systems into place, and you want to make sure from an architecture perspective, it all fits together well so that you're not having to reinvent the wheel later on. And this particular presentation is going to be focused more on the business and security side of things. How do we go through and align our architecture with business models, making sure that we are, and then also making sure that the security and privacy pieces are tied in. That's our focus. And if we go through and move on through the slide deck, and please feel free to ask questions as we go through, put them into the chat window, and I will do my, we'll get over to those as they come through. And I believe that we have our moderator, Brian, who's gonna help us make sure we get to all those questions. So the first question that I wanna make sure folks know is, who is this guy? You know, why is he up here talking? And so my background, people seem to, it's interesting. Had a chance to start off my career in retail, and I did some leadership while I was in the retail world, moved into the Marine Corps here in the United States, and then moved into pastoral ministry. So I've seen multiple sides of leadership and multiple sides of processes. And one of the things that I guess if you look at this and you think about my values as a professional, it's about service, retail, it's about discipline, Marine Corps, and it's about leadership or making connections, and that's the pastoral ministry piece. And that's been consistent. And so as you all are going through the architecture side and developing relationships and making sure that whatever architecture is being put in place, you have to build those relationships, and you have to have the discipline to make it all happen, and you have to have some customer service to make sure that you're keeping all of those needs met as you put everything together. And as I've been exercising those values through Lockheed Martin, if you're not familiar, well, at least when I was there, it was 130,000 people, global company, mostly defense. And so from that perspective, everything was super secret, hush, hush. And we had an opportunity to put some amazing technologies in place and to fight some very interesting cyber battles along the way. So really a great experience, great learning opportunity. That's when I came into IT and to security. So to grow up through the ranks in Lockheed Martin was outstanding. And to get to know some of the architects they have there was also phenomenal. I was then able to take all of that great experience over at Lockheed Martin and then bring it into a retail environment with ABC Fine Wine and Spirits. ABC Fine Wine and Spirits is a locally owned, here in Florida, owned and operated business. They focus on selling cigars, wines, beer, and that's their world. They've got about 120 stores here in the state of Florida. And so that was a major shift, right? You go from Lockheed Martin, extremely risk averse, to ABC Fine Wine and Spirits, who has a more aggressive risk posture. And so going through and right sizing all those processes and policies, it was a challenge, but it was fun. And it helped to move me into where I'm at today with Tupperware Brands, because again, in a retail type of environment, some additional considerations with Tupperware being global. We've got privacy to work through. We have manufacturing, we have distribution, we have all of those pieces, all the e-com, some of the similar pieces with ABC, and all of that has to be protected and from a privacy perspective, privacy perspective, make sure it's being accounted for. And so definitely have a lot of real world experience in this subject. So look forward to sharing some lessons from a leadership perspective and also from a security privacy perspective. Do I have certifications? Absolutely, won't bore you with them. Do I coach other professionals? Yes, I do. I love being part of an organization called SIM, which is a Society for Information Management. I have an opportunity to talk to people, help them grow their businesses, grow their practices, love it. Do I give back to the community? Yes. Sometimes just by going and participating in STEM events and helping students who are in the high school range of life to figure out what do they want to do in IT when they grow up. And that's rewarding. But also teaching at a local college and helping people who are coming up through the ranks to become either cyber or becoming IT people to know what to do next and to make sure they're positioning themselves to be best placed in the job market. It's a great way to give back. And so if you have an opportunity to do it, I encourage you to. It's been super fulfilling. And am I all work and no play? Maybe. I do. I mean, work, as you know, as many of you know, you're putting in a lot of hours to go through and to do the right thing for the company. And at the same time, you probably have some other things you do outside of the home that's not necessarily play. But at the same time, I do still spend a good amount of time with my family. I have a wife. I have 2 miniature schnauzers. We like to travel, so we do as much of that as we possibly can. And any time that work and play overlap, it's a beautiful thing. I love music. I've played the drums before. I'm a big, more like 70s, 80s rock, but I also go through and try to broaden out to the newer stuff too. Ed Sheeran. Star Wars, definitely a Star Wars fan. You might tell by the Darth Vader helmet. I've got a full cosplay outfit, and I'll go through and sometimes wear those to the STEM events to help bridge the gap. And then definitely a Disney fan. I live in Orlando, Florida area, Kissimmee, so I'm about 20 minutes away from Disney, and we're pass holders. That's one of those things we do on the weekend for fun when we feel like it. It's a tremendous blessing. So that's the guy. That's the guy who's standing in front of you talking, and we're going to keep moving forward. What I don't know is if this is in the way. So can you help me out for a minute, Brian? Can you tell me, is this in the way? All right, I'm just going to proceed.
Sorry, Lee, in the way of what?
Can you see my webinar?
We can see your presentation screen.
And that's it. Fantastic. That's what I want to make sure. All right, cool. Thank you very much. That was a technical glitch there I wasn't aware of. All right. So from a business and architecture perspective, that's the focus of the first part of the presentation, is business and architecture. And as you all know, as you go through the architecture world, good designers can create normalcy out of chaos. And then they have to go through and clearly communicate those ideas through organizing and manipulating words and pictures, because we frequently have to go through and sell our ideas to leaders to get them to go through and actually buy in and get the funding to do it. So that's what you all are here for. This is what you're doing. This is how you lead through the change of making architectural level changes. But one of the things that I look back over my career so far, and I say, okay, when I think about the architectures that I've encountered along the way, what are some of those common themes, just big picture? And some of those common themes is that when I look back at the architecture, the architecture reflects the values of the company. So for example, take a Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin has layers of architecture. They have a set of architecture for their super secret area. They have a set of architecture for their more public areas. And then they have another set of architecture for anything else that might be focused or point for a particular project. And that design in and of itself goes through and reflects what that company does. It's their business model. It's how they make money. And so it's really interesting to look at that and go, okay, so this is a multi-tiered architecture environment. It reflects the complexity of what they do. It reflects the complexity of their business model, and it makes a lot of sense. Now, in contrast, I look at ABC Fine Wine and Spirits. So ABC Fine Wine and Spirits had a fairly straightforward architecture in the grand scheme of things. We go through and we have our e-com environment. We've got our ERP systems. We've got our security tools. We've got our HRISs. And once you figure out how to go through and to blend those all together, connect them all, that's compared to having 3 tiers, you've got 1 tier. And so that model that ABC had was very much reflected their simplicity, really the simplicity of their model to keep their business moving forward. To be honest, at the end of the day, that business wasn't so much about selling products. It was more about the real estate and how the family was going through and using real estate to go through and further it. And wine and spirits was really more of just a matter of how do we go through and maintain that real estate and have a profitable business alongside with it. So again, reflecting that business model. And then at Tupperware, it's yet another monster. And what I mean by another monster is we have starting off very decentralized. So you have pockets of ERPs, you have pockets of HR systems, pockets of all these other systems, and they're just kind of scattered all over the place. But it reflects the organization. It reflects their culture, that they grew up very decentralized. Each market went through as the business needed to and developed systems to support sales, because at the end of the day, their bread and butter is sales. And so each of these architectures reflects the values of that company. So I ask you, if you think about the architecture of the company that you're part of, what does it say about your company? Are you decentralized? Are you centralized? Do you have multi-tiers, and because you're super concerned about secret areas and not so much in other areas? I mean, that's an interesting conversation just in and of itself, to know what you're working with. Question I challenge you to ask about your architecture is, does your architecture that you have documented, does it reflect where you've been, or does it reflect where you're going? And the reason why I'm asking that question is because even now with Tupperware and with the organizations I've been part of, yes, that we have a set of documents that say, here's where we've been from an architecture, here's where we are today, and it reflects where we've been. But then we have another set of documents that say, here's where we're going. And so the idea is that right now we're trying to bridge from the past to the future. And so I challenge you to go through and have a set of documents that help you to go through and to bridge that gap and to be able to sell those ideas to your leadership team if you don't have them already. If you're mature, I'm sure you have it already. I'm going to move on. Okay, so when we think a little bit more about the business and how the business, now from an architecture perspective, what I've striven to do as I've worked at ABC and as I've worked at Tupperware and even at Lockheed, was to go through and to create something that matched where the business was in its life cycle. So if you think about the company that you're in, there's this book called The First 90 Days. And in the first 90 days, your goal is to start your job in a new opportunity. When you're starting your job, what are the things you need to do in the first 90 days to be successful? And the model that you operate in the first 90 days is finding out if your company is in startup mode, is your company in a sustainment mode, is your company kind of failing and therefore it needs to go into realignment mode, or has it really failed and need to go into turnaround mode? And then if you've gone down to the other end, as you've gone to shut down divestiture mode. And during each of these phases, there's a different set of architectures that can go along with it. And so part of the way that we as architects can go through and to stay ahead of the curve, or as leaders stay ahead of the curve, is realize where we're at as a business, and then be able to position what does our next generation architecture look like to support where we need to be. If we find ourselves in sustaining success, what does that look like? And how is that different from startup mentality? So I'll give you a case in point. When I was working at ABC Fine Wine and Spirits, I was challenged to go through and to take the systems that we had and to rethink all those systems as if we were a startup. How would we go through and change the platforms that we were using? How would we change the integration and connections that we were using to be a startup so that we could be fresh and nimble with everything that we did? And so maybe there's some value to this mentality or this mindset, the diagram, as you're going through and thinking about your diagrams and how you go through and position your architecture within your company. And as a leader, I like being a few steps ahead. I like knowing, okay, right now I'm in the sustaining success model, but really I'm realigning. And so as I realigned, where do I want to be next? Where do we want to take the company to next? And another example here is how I suspect several of you have been in the position to where you come into a company and you're at one level of maturity and it's not as mature as you want it to be. So you can either spend your time backfilling all that maturity to get up to where you need to be, or you can say, you know what, we're never going to backfill this in a reasonable amount of time in dollars, or whatever your currency is. And so what we're going to do instead is, instead of aiming to backfill, we're going to aim to reposition. We're going to aim to leapfrog from point A to point B. And if we're aiming to leapfrog, then it's a different set of conversations, and it's a different set of connections and approaches to how to reschedule your infrastructure, your architecture, to make it work. So I like this model because it helps me to focus on where's the business at right now, and how do I adjust my architecture and even individual system designs to work. Let this build out. Coming from Lockheed had a very mature set of processes already in place. Whereas over the past 7 or so years, I've either worked with companies or I've been part of companies where they've been taking a slow, steady set of steps to get to what I'm going to call an architecture review board. So if we go to this some pinnacle of maturity that we call an architecture review board, or even expand that even greater, there's usually what I've seen is a set of steps. And maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't. I'm curious if you do, I'm curious if you don't. What I typically see is the company first, they go through and they introduce some change management. So on their existing infrastructure, they say, hey, we need to know when infrastructure changes are happening. We want to make sure that they get approved, that they follow a certain set of processes. And then once they go through and they have that change management on the infrastructure, then they go, hey, wait, there's some benefits here. We're now seeing, we've seen that our downtime has reduced. We're seeing that we know what's happening in our environment, and we're able to communicate with our business partners, and our business partners appreciate the transparency. They appreciate knowing when something's going to change so that they see that IT's on top of things. Then they go, okay, well, now that we're seeing this kind of results with infrastructure, let's move this on to software development. And so we start adding some change management to software development. We do version control. We start doing all the right things from an idle perspective for software development. And then we see the same kind of results. Hey, we're not seeing as many code breakages along the way. We're not seeing as much downtime along the way. Or if we do see downtime, we knew that it was happening during a particular window and we were able to fall back really fast. Or we were able to just correct it really fast because we knew what was happening during that time frame and all the resources were on deck, instead of what used to be where we were just going through and putting changes out there and hopefully the right people were available whenever the change was made. And then we go from that change management of development into some type of a community of excellence. And so we start getting the architects, the system engineers, they start talking and saying, hey, let's go through and make things better. How do we architect a better solution? And then that gets formalized or codified into some type of a board. And those kind of the steps that I've seen along the way. How about you all? I'd be curious to know if you've seen similar steps along the way. And one of the quotes that has resonated with me as I was researching for this presentation was, if you truly want to understand something, try to change it. And I suspect that many of you have seen this along the way that you've gone through and you decided to change an architecture, try to change a system. And as you do it, you go through and you find out, oh, oops, I didn't realize that was happening. And it's an opportunity for us to know more about the business, to be better aligned. And it's also an opportunity for us to be better at leadership, managing change. But yeah, if you want to truly understand this, try to change it. The other piece that as technologists that we recognize is that we can go through and come up with a lofty architecture design and say that we're going to solve world peace with our particular design, but there's quite often a disconnect between what the business is thinking and what the technologists are thinking. And I love this diagram because it's one that's many companies are working through today or have been for the past few years, thinking about AI. So typically a business person is going to think about it from data, then there's this box called artificial intelligence, and then there's this other box called value. And hey, if we can just plug in AI, then all of our data magically becomes value. And to them, that's what it is. And I've had to run through that situation with ABC Fine Wine and Spirits and here at Tupperware Brands of going through and helping those teams. I break this down, and what I like to call it is geek engineer. At heart, I'm a geek engineer. I like to go through things and take things and pick them apart into their component pieces and then manage them, roll them all back up into a solution that works for everybody. And so that's what we wind up doing. And you can see the complexity that really happens underneath that value statement or that AI statement. But working at ABC and at Tupperware, it has been a journey to go through and to say, okay, here's where we're trying to get to. We all recognize that here's where we're trying to get to. And now let's go through and say, all right, well, here are the pieces that need to happen. These are the governance pieces that need to happen. Here are the systems that need to be put in place. Here's what clean data looks like. What do we want to be our master data set? We go through and answer all those questions to help the business and the technology teams align and come up with the right solution. And sometimes that's just a matter of coming back to one of my favorite security phrases, and that's never let a good event go to waste. And one reason that's been valuable to me is because in the data space, I've been in places where they have one team, the marketing team, bringing one report that talks about sales numbers. The accounting team brings another report that talks about sales numbers. And you bring all this together, and the source systems teams brings yet another report that talks about sales numbers, and those numbers are different. Sometimes, and maybe one sales report includes tax, another one doesn't include tax. And then another one is excluding a certain amount of sales because it's return sales. And so they've come up with some kind of metric that means something to them within their department, but it may not give the right set of data up to the executive leadership team. And so as we're designing our systems, whether it's AI or whatever architecture we're trying to put into place, it's about making sure that we make everything magic. That's our goal. That's my goal when it comes to putting these systems together. I don't need my CEO or my CFO to understand the magic of how all this works together, but there are just a few key points that I want them to understand. I do want them to understand that, hey, there's some data massaging that needs to occur. We need to go through and then sort and filter this data in a way that makes sense. What do you want out of the data? So that I make sure that I deliver the right report with the right value. So that typically then what happens is that once we have the right report, we start stripping off all those other reports we don't need anymore. So it becomes death by attrition, and that standardization by attrition, as opposed to trying to kill things off proactively, which I didn't have as much success with. I found more success with putting solutions in place and then migrating people to them, and then they don't need the other solution. And then from a technology perspective, we talked about that. All right, so let's switch gears a little bit. I'm taking off my infrastructure architect hat and I'm putting on my CISO hat. And as I put on my CISO hat and think about security and privacy, and one thing that I've appreciated is the willingness of each team to go, whether it's an infrastructure team, our privacy team, our legal team, to come to the table and to talk about risk of that particular system and what it means. And so if I were to offer you a baseline set of data checks to be able to say, hey, we've done a basic risk assessment on this solution or on this architecture, these are the baseline set of starting points that I encourage you to take. 1, contracts. 2, what type of data do you have and how much of it do you have? And then 3, what's the solution design? I mean, just super high level, super big picture, make it so anybody who gets a 3-point slide can understand it. That's it. What are my contractual obligations and contractual commitments from our partners? What's the data that I have? Do I have PCI data, PII data, GDPR data, privacy data? What kind of data do I have? And then the design. And that's where usually the rubber hits the road and we get into the nitty-gritty details of Visio diagrams or pick your diagramming platform. So what does that look like? So in reality, if I go through and I have a partner who's coming to me and say, hey, Lee, I want to put in a new HRIS. Okay, well, who do you want to work with? And okay, I want to work with company A. So we're going to work with company A. All right, we go through, we have those initial conversations, we make sure there's an NDA in place, a non-disclosure agreement, so that we can share information and not worry about it going anywhere. And then secondly, we put the master services agreement in place for whatever services or software needs to be there and whatever SLAs need to be in place. And then along with that, there are usually legal requirements around uptime or even indemnity or liability for solutions. And so that language gets massaged out in the MSA. And then the DPA, the Data Protection Agreement, it's going to go through and cover more of those privacy items. And I'm not sure if everybody here on the call is more on the US side, if they're more on the international side, but this has been a requirement from a GDPR perspective, and we're using it pretty much globally, whether it's LGPD down in Brazil, CCPA here in the US, or even if it's PIPL over in China, or POPIA, POPIA down in South Africa. So we're using the same methodology of the DPA to say, okay, are all the privacy boxes checked? So the legal team comes up with the right contract, and what they do is they add to it, they append to it this, are all the security requirements met for that partner? We're not, at this point, we're not going through and vetting the security of the solution, we're only vetting the security of the partner. And so as we vet the security of the partner, this is where the analogy I like to use is a fast pass. If you come to me with a SOC 2 or pick your certification, then you get more of a fast pass. Now, and that works in a smaller company or a company that doesn't have as many resources tied to it. But if I'm in a Lockheed Martin, that security review is going to be much more stringent. There's going to be a questionnaire. I'm going to do more due diligence to go through and to dig into each one of those data points. And there's probably going to be more data points. Is this a safe and stable company? How long have they been in business? So all that's going to tie into this DPA and security process to make sure that we're doing our due diligence on the company itself. And then once we get past that contracts piece, we know that we're dealing with a safe and privacy-aware company that is going to take care of us. We've got our confidentiality, we've got our integrity, and we've got our availability. That's the idea of the company and the contracts. Now, once we get past the contract phase, then we're taking a deeper dive into the amount of data that's there. because for those who are aware, you know that once you know how much data you have and what type of data you have, then you know how secure or how much privacy concerns you need to address whenever you get into your operations and your solution. And so we define how much data is there. If there's PCI data, well, guess what? Now we've got not only the company standards to deal with when it comes to security and privacy, but then we have the PCI, payment card industry standards. If we're in Europe and we've got GDPR, or even if we're US and have GDPR information, then we know we have some additional rules we're gonna have to follow as well. And defining that data just means some type of a questionnaire. It doesn't have to be 20 pages, but it should be enough to say, hey, here's the owner of the system, here's what the system does, here's the data subjects involved. Are they employees? Are they vendors? Are they, in our case, Salesforce, or are they customers? And so depending on what data points are there, then it starts to navigate which laws apply and how concerned you need to be with each of the requirements around privacy or security. And then once you have all that great data behind you, you can then design a good solution, a solid solution, and address your key concerns. And then ultimately this solution gets tracked. And what I typically do is I've actually borrowed from PCI. PCI requires that you go through and you have a data flow diagram and that you have a design diagram. And so if I have a data flow diagram, which is a big picture, here's where the data is going from point A to point B. I've got my data inventory list that says, here's the types of data I have going from point A to point B. Well, now I know, okay, big picture, here's where I need to focus. So then I can go through and flip over to this design document. And then with that design document, I can then say, okay, here are the protections around each of these data movements or around these stationary data objects. So it gives me the ability to go through and drill in and to do a good objective review and to provide a right-sized solution to whatever design gets floated out there. So big picture, wasn't trying to dive into all the details of the security and privacy, but wanted to give you a quick overview of those three key things I look for. I look at contracts, I look at data, and I look at the overall design of the solution. And then as I start to wind down, as I go through everything that I do, it's about the spirit of partnership. And this is why I focus it back onto leadership. Because again, if you want to make enemies, try to change something, Woodrow Wilson. And so in order to avoid making enemies along the way, because I've tried that approach of just ramming things down people's throats, it doesn't work so well. I've tried being the office of no, that doesn't work so well either. And what's worked the best for me is to develop partnerships. I found that from a security and privacy perspective, the legal team is a fantastic partner. Is there education involved? Absolutely. On the technology side of things, I find that the IT people, my best partners. They get it, they understand it, and my job is to make their lives as straightforward and as simple as possible. And so develop those partnerships. And where I've come from a situation where I've had to grow things small to big. And I haven't had the luxury of coming into an organization and just saying, we're going to go through and spend millions, billions of dollars, and we're going to just do this right up front. I've always had to go in step-by-step increments. And so if you find yourself in that situation where you have to go in step-by-step increments, then just start. You may have to start small, but start. And I go back to that statement, failing to plan is planning to fail. Don't do anything. Don't not do anything. Go ahead and do something and start small. And that's why I was pointing to a little bit earlier, those stair steps, that pyramid design of where do you start at the bottom, moving your way up. Start to introduce these changes so that people see that the change is good. The change that we're implementing, we do it correctly within ourselves. And that was another aha moment for me at ABC, Fine Wine and Spirits. It was when I had gotten to the point where I took off just being the security person and I then became responsible for infrastructure as well. That was one of those knighting moments where they go through and they say, Lee, you've done such a good job of making these changes happen. We trust you to do something more. We trust you to be responsible for more. And that's my basic philosophy, is to start small, make it so that people trust you more and more. And then over the course of a year or two, hopefully you've built your relationships, you've built your connections, you've built your partnerships. And with that, you can continue to drive, you can push that boundary to do more and more. And definitely it's just about discipline, treating it as a project. If I go through and know who my stakeholders are or need to be, then I know whom I need to go make relationships with, and then start building those relationships and then communicating, here's the vision of where we want to go. I need your help. Will you help me? Or here's what I need from you, and here's when I need it by. Can you do it? And then get their buy-in and make it happen. And then just manage the change. I didn't put any slides in here on a change management cycle. And when I say change management cycle, I'm talking about how change impacts people, not necessarily on change request cycles, but on how change impacts people. I love the analogy of looking at change as grief. You know, people go through, they start off and they say, oh no, this is horrible. So they wind up down in this valley and they go, this change stinks. And then you have to kind of drag them out of that, this change stinks, up to this is okay, and it's all going to be okay. In fact, it might even be better. And so you get them out of the valley, you get them back up on the mountaintop, and then life is good again. But that's a process that people have to go through. And I wish that we didn't have to go through that process emotionally, but we do. And that's what we wind up having to fight along the way. And I don't know, fight's a strong word. We have to go through and manage. We have to go through shepherd, whatever, pick your term. We have to go through and manage that change along the way. And then my last slide for content has to do with managing change again. So there's another book, Switch. And what I love about this book is it talks about how to manage change, behavior change. And so the analogy here is that you've got a rider, you've got an elephant, and you've got a path. And when you think about people have an intellect. Okay, the intellect, your brains, your engineering smarts, that's the rider. The emotions, that's your elephant. And then the path is the way that we do things. And so your best bang for your buck is if you can go through and make the path down the road you want people to go down as smooth as possible. And you do that by going through and tweaking the environment, building habits. You can look in the bottom left-hand corner and making sure the herd is on board with it so that you're different. If you're different, then that kind of helps to shape your path. People don't like being different. They like being part of the group. If you want to go through and change the emotional reaction to what's going on to motivate the elephant, find that feeling. What is the feeling you need to engage? If I want to go through and patch every system in my environment, just knowing that it's smart thing to do isn't going to get the buy-in that I need. I'm going to have to go through and create some kind of emotion. And part of that emotion is never let a good event go to waste. So if something happens in my environment that says, hey, here's a weakness, then I can go through and say, hey, if this weakness gets exploited, here's what happens to us. And it happened to our partner over here, then, or it happened to some other company like us, then that's my emotion to go through and say, hey, we need to do this. Here's the feeling. And then make the change as small as possible. People don't like big changes. If we can go through and say, hey, we're really just making a tweak. And we're not going to go through and change the process forever. We're going to make this a trial change. We're going to do it for 2 weeks, a month, and see how it goes. And then what happens is because it becomes habit, people just say, this is fine. It doesn't hurt, so we can keep doing it. And then grow your people. Make sure that people grow along the way in order to understand the value of the change so that then it becomes an intrinsic motivation as opposed to something that you've got to convince them of. And the intellect is usually what we do the best job with. We find where things work and we point people in the direction, hey, that works, let's do that. And then give people all the direction that you possibly can, educate them. So what we did is we walked through, number one, leadership perspectives of doing enterprise architecture. How do we connect that to the overall business, the business model, and business missions? And then we started getting into some of the security risk assessments, security privacy risk assessments, and then we closed out with some organizational change management. That's what we covered in a nutshell. So I'm going to pass the baton back to you all. What questions do you have? Or where do you disagree?
Lee, thank you so much for your presentation, hugely insightful. If you'd like to stop sharing your presentation and join me back on screen, that would be fantastic. And we will go through some questions in the time we've got ahead of us. I'm going to start with a very simple one, which was offered by No Santa Cruz. And she's just asked a couple of things around a couple of the acronyms which you used. I'm familiar with them myself, but let you answer them as part of that. No really wants to know, what do you mean by ARB and COE first?
Okay.
English language
so
first.
My apologies. It's getting into the, if you work in defense or in any field, you wind up with acronyms that you have to go back and explain and you just take for granted. So my apologies. I do my best to explain those and I missed it.
Not a problem.
So ARB is an architecture review board, an architecture review board. And then the COE is the community of excellence. And the community of excellence is usually just a group of people who they share a passion for something and they want to do it the best that they possibly can inside that organization. And then the architecture review board would be one step up from a formality perspective, where you're taking that community of excellence and you're changing it into a structured process that occurs every time.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lee, for putting it through there. Now, something that's been sort of running as a theme, but has not been fully articulated, as you did at the start, really kind of builds around a couple of the questions we've got here. And it's to do with the kind of your company sort of values versus the architecture that either exists or is developed in the organization. And you also mentioned the differences between two entirely different businesses, obviously one in retail, one in the defense realm, where the architecture had developed to really reflect the company values.
Yep.
And it's quite interesting the way that you articulated that process. What we find is that people sometimes within organizations struggle to understand what the company values are, depending where you are in the chain. And if you're then saying that there's an architecture that's built around the company values, which not everybody may be that familiar with, how difficult does that make that position for the sort of EA community within that organization, especially if they want to change it?
That's a great question. And, I hadn't thought about that line of thinking. And there are certain things I take for granted, right? I've had, 15 plus years of experience doing this. And so I have that experience to draw from. And so now when I look back, I can see those patterns. Whereas if you don't have that same level of experience, then maybe you miss the pattern. So that's a possibility. So I'll first off look at myself and say, where am I privileged? And then how can I go through and make sure that I'm not using that as a barrier for something else? That was my intention. And then, but if I wanted to teach somebody else to do this, so let's say, for example, I do teach a class at Valencia, and that class is basically watching them go through the paces of building out some type of new architecture, some type of new design. And so as I'm trying to teach them what to look for, part of what I'd have them look for is first a principle. Words matter, but actions matter more. Because what we spend our money on means a lot more than what we say. So if we go through and we're spending millions of dollars on a particular activity, then there's a high likelihood that that means a lot to us. As opposed to something that we're spending $20 on, it probably means less to us. So keep in mind that basic principle. So when I go through and I think about what's happening or what happened in my past, so when I came on board and there wasn't a lot of structure around IT, well, they didn't have as much value of IT and what it could do for them. And so it took some education and it took some building trust to see that. And so if I were to walk into an organization and I were to see complete decentralization, a lot of duplicated tools, then I would start to see that picture that, hey, maybe what's going on here is that they haven't seen the value of having a standard set of tooling to reduce the overall cost and the consistency of service, and even the not just the overall cost of IT, but the overall cost of each department. So for example, if we could go through and have a standard HR platform, would we really need to have 10 people in each country doing HR? Maybe not. And that's worth at least looking at to promote the value. And so that's one area I would look at. I'd be looking at where's the money being spent. I'd be looking at how decentralized are things. I'd be looking at how much tool overlap is there. Are they using 5 different tools for patch management? Are they using 5 different tools for an ERP, enterprise resource planning tool set? Well, what's happening there? And then that helps me to understand how structured has it been, how much intention has it gotten, and really those are just opportunities. Those are opportunities to come to the table and say, hey, we can go through and make this overall process better by standardizing. For example, most of the time in companies that have multiple ERPs, they have a hard time rolling up their finances when it's time to go through and do your quarterly reports. And for a public company that has to do that quarterly or more frequently, just to be able to track what they're doing, that's a labor-intensive activity. So if you can go through as a technology leader and say, we can go through and reduce all these platforms down to one, or from an architecture perspective, we're going to go through and have an application layer we're going to have a data layer, and then we're going to have a reporting layer. And so now if you give them a reporting layer that the executive leadership team can use, and that reporting layer has connections into all the data applications and databases, well, now you can start going through and consolidating all those applications and databases as time allows, and the leadership team only sees that front end application, so they don't know it happens, and they don't care. All they know is that their costs are going down because you're consolidating down to one platform. So those are some things to think about as you go through. I hope I answered your question. If there was a dynamic of that you wanted some more insight on, I'd love to explore some more.
Fantastic. Lee, I'm sure that the individuals that ask questions will be able to follow up afterwards, and we always encourage that with our audiences. So look out for that follow-up afterwards. Just sort of extending that one step further, one of the key changes that we've all seen from an enterprise architect perspective is the outright demand now from the business side of things to start with value propositions that make sense to the business rather than doing something because it makes it better or it adds interest to an enterprise architect's job. One of the things that you then sort of alluded to during your piece was this sort of 90-day environment, which I'm sure that we're all in managerial roles. We've all sort of led teams. We've all had to go through that impact 90-day proposition at some stage in our careers.
Yeah.
Given that you kind of have entrenched value propositions, there are slightly nuanced views, shall we say, of what an enterprise architecture is or the team should be. And we know that it takes time to build trust and educate people. Mm-hmm. In your sort of experience and what you're recommending on, what would you recommend that somebody taking on a new role as a leader within the enterprise architecture space, or even joining an existing team where they're being perceived as somebody who can add value, what should they be looking to achieve in that 90 days that adds real value to their future job prospects within that organization?
So there's always three opportunities. So you've got your start, your stop, and your continue. And so what you can do is you can make sure that you understand what each stakeholder wants, and if there's anything that your team needs to stop doing, you can help reshift their priorities so that they stop doing it. And if you can help them to stop doing, the team to stop doing things, or you can stop doing things that are baked in processes, then that's a win. From a continue perspective, if you can find out what is it that the team is doing well, or that your successor did well, make sure you keep doing that so that you continue to show that value. And then from a start perspective, then you see what have you already started. And then I'm going to go back to what have you already started? What projects have you already started and why? And that's not typically a 2-month turnaround. That's typically maybe a week turnaround. You just have the right set of conversations with the right stakeholders. Now you know what the end consumer wants. You know, our consumers in most cases from an architect's perspective. You find out what the end consumers want. You find out what the system engineer believes is going on, and then you negotiate that. You tie it all together into a nice, concise story, and be able to articulate it, and then deliver it. And sometimes you can't deliver the whole thing, but if you can go through and be a project manager and say, hey, within 90 days, all that I can promise you is that in the first 30 days, we're going to give you a prototype. It's not going to work, but it's going to be a screen. You're going to see what kind of screen you're going to get when this is said and done. And then within 60 days, we're going to go through and give you a screen with these 3 functions working. And then in 90 days, we're going to give you a screen with these 5 functions working. And then those quick wins can be helpful for you to position you as somebody who delivers on results and as someone who understands their pain and is helping them get there. The more that we can get to minimum viable products is helpful. And I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but just in the bigger picture of what can we do to deliver, those mean a lot as I go through and engage with different stakeholders.
Lee, thank you very much for that. One final question, which is one from myself really. I'm a researcher by heart, so I'm trying to sort of see how these things sort of grow and develop. One of the things that I've noted over the last, especially over the last, I suppose, 18 months, is the kind of correlation between, or rather the coming together of the CISO role and the sort of EA leadership role. Is there a role there that is being identified and developing within organizations such as Tupperware, where that is now becoming a conjoined role rather than just a separate CISO role and a separate EA leader role?
I'm not seeing that within Tupperware. I didn't see that within Lockheed. What I did, so at ABC Fine Wine and Spirits, again, you're looking at a multinational companies versus a state company, a state level company. So at that state level company with roughly, I think it was 7,000 employees, something like that. Maybe it wasn't that many. It was just a smaller footprint from an employee perspective. What I do explain to folks is that, you know, as you get into a bigger company, there's more dollars for more silos.
Yes.
So in bigger companies, you wind up with having the CISO being a separate role than an architect, and the architect being a separate role from a CTO, and a CTO being a separate role from a CIO. Now they may all roll up to the CIO, but they're different hats because they have different focal areas. But in a smaller company like an ABC Fine Wine and Spirits, I was almost all of those. I wasn't the CIO, but I was responsible for just about everything else. And so I was wearing all those hats. Now that when we find ourselves in a smaller company, it does give us that ability to wear all those hats, which is kind of cool. If you like the variety and you can manage the change, it's a great spot to be in. But it is a challenge. It's a challenge in itself to wear all those hats. And so you figure out where your passion is at, you figure out where your capabilities are at, and take it from there. But I think I answered your question. I think it depends on the size of the company.
Lee, thank you so much for joining me. An insightful presentation. And just to say to the audience, if you do want to follow up afterwards, Lee has kindly said that is something that you can do. The same with all of the speakers. And Lee's presentation will be on demand with the others throughout the year. So please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee. And Lee, thank you very much for joining us. That's very much appreciated. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate it.
Not a problem. Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, next up, we have Chris Hodges coming back to take on the chair role, for which I'm very grateful. And Chris, how are you doing? You muted though, and who's coming back to join us from there. And Chris will be introducing Craig Milroy from Microsoft, who will be doing a fantastic presentation around the role of data-driven digital transformation, enterprise architecture, and the chief data officer, which will add another great perspective to the enterprise architecture space. So we look forward to catching up with you all at the top of the hour, and please don't hesitate to take a quick break and join us in about 10 minutes. Take care. Bye-bye.